Jules Verne's The Mysterious Island, a rare sequel from an author not known for them, and in this case, to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, his most famous work. If you enjoy this sort of content, I hope you'll remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. And don't forget to join us over on Twitch for our readings Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays at 6 p.m. Pacific. And now, on to the story. Chapter 7. The settlers in Lincoln Island had now regained their dwelling without having been obliged to reach it by the old opening, and were therefore spared the trouble of mason's work. It was certainly lucky that at the moment they were about to set out to do so, the apes had been seized with that terror no less sudden than inexplicable, which had driven them out of Granite House. Had the animals discovered that they were about to be attacked from another direction? This was the only explanation of their sudden retreat. During the day, the bodies of the apes were carried into the wood where they were buried. Then the settlers busied themselves in repairing the disorder caused by the intruders. Disorder, but not damage, for although they had turned everything in the rooms topsy-turvy, yet they had broken nothing. Neb relighted his stove, and the stores in the larder furnished a substantial repast, to which all did ample justice. Jupe was not forgotten, and he ate with relish some stone pine almonds and rhizome roots, with which he was abundantly supplied. Pencroft had unfastened his arms, but judged it best to have his legs tied until they were more sure of his submission. Then, before retiring to rest, Harding and his companions, seated round their table, discussed those plans, the execution of which was most pressing. The most important and most urgent was the establishment of a bridge over the Mersey, so as to form a communication with the southern part of the island and Granite House. Then the making of an enclosure for the mushrooms, or other woolly animals which they wished to capture. These two projects would help to solve the difficulty as to their clothing, which was now serious. The bridge would render easy the transport of the balloon case, which would furnish them with linen, and the inhabitants of the enclosure would yield wool which would supply them with winter clothes. As to the enclosure, it was Cyrus Harding's intention to establish it at the sources of the Red Creek, where the ruminants would find fresh and abundant pasture. The road between Prospect Heights and the sources of the stream was already partly beaten, and with a better cart than the first, the material could be easily conveyed to the spot, especially if they could manage to capture some animal to draw it. But though there might be no inconvenience in the enclosure being so far from Granite House, it would not be the same with the poultry yard, to which Neb called the attention of the colonists. It was indeed necessary that the bird should be close within reach of the cook, and no place appeared more favorable for the establishment of the said poultry yard than that portion of the banks of the lake which was close to the old opening. Water birds would prosper there as well as others, and the couple of tinamous taken in their last excursion would be the first to be domesticated. The next day, the 3rd of November, the new works were begun by the construction of the bridge, and all hands were required for this important task. Saws, hatchets, and hammers were shouldered by the settlers, who now, transformed into carpenters, descended to the shore. There Pencroft observed, "Suppose that during our absence Master Jupe takes it into his head to draw up the ladder which he so politely returned to us yesterday." "Let us tie its lower end down firmly," replied Cyrus Harding. This was done by means of 2 stakes securely fixed in the sand. Then the settlers, ascending the left bank of the Mersey, soon arrived at the angle formed by the river. There they halted in order to ascertain if the bridge could be thrown across. The place appeared suitable. In fact, from this spot to Port Balloon, discovered the day before on the southern coast, there was only a distance of 3 miles and a half, and from the bridge to the port it would be easy to make a good cart road, which would render the communication between Granite House and the south of the island extremely easy. Cyrus Harding now imparted to his companions a scheme for completely isolating Prospect Heights, so as to shelter it from the attacks both of quadrupeds and quadrumana. In this way, Granite House, the chimneys, the poultry yard, and all the upper part of the plateau which was to be used for cultivation would be protected against the depredations of animals. Nothing could be easier than to execute this project, and this is how the engineer intended to set to work. The plateau was already defended on 3 sides by watercourses, either artificial or natural. On the northwest, by the shores of Lake Grant, from the entrance of the passage, the breach made the banks of the lake for the escape of the water. On the north, from this breach to the sea, by the new watercourse which had hollowed out a bed for itself across the plateau and shore, above and below the fall, and it would be enough to dig the bed of this creek a little deeper to make it impracticable for animals, on all the eastern border by the sea itself, from the mouth of the aforesaid creek to the mouth of the Mersey. Lastly, on the south, from the mouth to the turn of the Mersey, where the bridge was to be established. The western border of the plateau now remained between the turn of the river and the southern angle of the lake, a distance of about a mile, which was open to all comers. But nothing could be easier than to dig a broad, deep ditch, which could be filled from the lake, and the overflow of which would throw itself by a rapid fall into the bed of the Mersey. The level of the lake would no doubt be somewhat lowered by this fresh discharge of its waters, but Cyrus Harding had ascertained that the volume of water in the Red Creek was considerable enough to allow the execution of this project. So then, added the engineer, Prospect Heights will become a regular island, being surrounded with water on all sides and only communicating with the rest of our domain by the bridge which we are about to throw across the Mersey, the 2 little bridges already established above and below the fall, and lastly 2 other little bridges which must be constructed, one over the canal which I propose to dig, the other across to the left bank of the Mersey. Now, if these bridges can be raised at will, Prospect Heights will be guarded from any surprise. The bridge was the most urgent work. Trees were selected, cut down, stripped of their branches, and cut into beams, joists, and planks. The end of the bridge, which rested on the right bank of the Mersey, was to be firm, but the other end, on the left bank, was to be movable, so that it might be raised by means of a counterpoise, as some canal bridges are managed. This was certainly a considerable work, and though it was skillfully conducted, it took some time, for the Mersey at this place was 80 feet wide. It was therefore necessary to fix piles in the bed of the river so as to sustain the floor of the bridge and establish a pile driver to act on the tops of these piles, which would thus form 2 arches and allowed the bridge to support heavy loads. Happily, there was no want of tools with which to shape the wood, nor of ironwork to make it firm, nor of the ingenuity of a man who had a marvelous knowledge of the work, nor lastly the zeal of his companions, who in 7 months had necessarily acquired great skill in the use of their tools, and it must be said that not the least skillful was Gideon Spilett, who in dexterity almost equaled the sailor himself. Who would ever have expected so much from a newspaper man? Thought Pencroft. The construction of the Mersey Bridge lasted 3 weeks of regular hard work. They even breakfasted on the scene of their labors, and the weather being magnificent, they only returned to Granite House to sleep. During this period it may be stated that Master Jup grew more accustomed to his new masters, whose movements he always watched with very inquisitive eyes. However, as a precautionary measure, Pencroft did not as yet allow him complete liberty, rightly wishing to wait until the limits of the plateau should be settled by the projected works. Top and Jup were good friends and played willingly together, but Jup did everything solemnly. On the 20th of November the bridge was finished. The movable part, balanced by the counterpoise, swung easily, and only a slight effort was needed to raise it. Between its hinge and the last crossbar on which it rested when closed, there existed a space of 20 feet, which was sufficiently wide to prevent any animals from crossing. The settlers now began to talk of fetching the balloon case, which they were anxious to place in perfect security. But to bring it, it would be necessary to take a cart to Port Balloon, and consequently necessary to beat a road through the dense forests of the far west. This would take some time. Also, Neb and Pencroft having gone to examine into the state of things at Port Balloon, and reported that the stock of cloth would suffer no damage in the grotto where it was stored, it was decided that the work at Prospect Heights should not be discontinued. That, observed Pencroft, will enable us to establish our poultry yard under better conditions, since we need have no fear of visits from foxes, nor the attacks of other beasts. Then, added Neb, we can clear the plateau and transplant wild plants to it. And prepare a second cornfield, cried the sailor with a triumphant air. In fact, the first cornfield sown with a single grain had prospered admirably, thanks to Pencroft's care. It had produced the 10 years foretold by the engineer, and each year containing 80 grains, the colony found itself in possession of 800 grains in 6 months, which promised a double harvest each year. These 800 grains, except 50, which were prudently reserved, were to be sown in a new field, but with no less care than was bestowed on the single grain. The field was prepared, then surrounded with a strong palisade, high and pointed, which quadrupeds would have had difficulty in leaping. As to birds, some scarecrows, due to Pencroft's ingenious brain, were enough to frighten them. The 750 grains deposited in very regular furrows were then left for nature to do the rest. On the 21st of November, Cyrus Harding began to plan the canal which was to close the plateau on the west, from the south angle of Lake Grant to the angle of the Mercy. There was 2 or 3 feet of vegetable earth, and below that granite. It was therefore necessary to manufacture some more nitroglycerin, and the nitroglycerin did its accustomed work. In less than a fortnight, a ditch, 12 feet wide and 6 deep, was dug out in the hard ground of the plateau. A new trench was made by the same means in the rocky border of the lake, forming a small stream, to which they gave the name of Creek Glycerin, and which was thus an affluent of the Mercy. As the engineer had predicted, the level of the lake was lowered, though very slightly. To complete the enclosure of the bed of the stream on the beach was considerably enlarged, and the sand supported by means of stakes. By the end of the first fortnight of December, these works were finished, and Prospect Heights, that is to say a sort of irregular pentagon having a perimeter of nearly 4 miles, surrounded by a liquid belt, was completely protected from predators of every description. During the month of December, the heat was very great. In spite of it, however, the settlers continued their work, and as they were anxious to possess a poultry yard, they forthwith commenced it. It is useless to say that since the enclosing of the plateau had been completed, Master Jup had been set at liberty. He did not leave his masters, and evinced no wish to escape. He was a gentle animal, though very powerful and wonderfully active. He was already taught to make himself useful by drawing loads of wood and carting away the stones which were extracted from the bed of Creek Glycerin. The poultry yard occupied an area of 200 square yards on the southeastern bank of the lake. It was surrounded by a palisade, and in it were constructed various shelters for the birds which were to populate it. These were simply built of branches and divided into compartments, made ready for the expected guests. The first were the 2 tinamous, which were not long in having a number of young ones. They had for companions 6 ducks, accustomed to the borders of the lake. Some belonged to the Chinese species, of which the wings opened like a fan, and which by the brilliancy of their plumage rival the golden pheasants. A few days afterwards, Herbert snared a couple of gallinaceae, with spread tails composed of long feathers, magnificent electors, which soon became tame. As to pelicans, kingfishers, water hens, they came of themselves to the shores of the poultry yard, and this little community, after some disputes, cooing, screaming, clucking, ended by settling down peacefully and increased in encouraging proportion for the future use of the colony. Cyrus Harding, wishing to complete his performance, established a pigeon house in a quarter of the poultry yard. There he lodged 12 of those pigeons which frequented the rocks of the plateau. These birds soon became accustomed to returning every evening to their new dwelling, and showed more disposition to domesticate themselves than the congeners, the wood pigeons. Lastly, the time had come for turning the balloon case to use by cutting it up to make shirts and other articles, for as to keeping it in its present form and risking themselves in a balloon filled with gas above a sea of the limits of which they had no idea, It was not to be thought of. It was necessary to bring the case to Granite House, and the colonists employed themselves in rendering their heavy cart lighter and more manageable. But though they had a vehicle, the moving power was yet to be found. But did there not exist in the island some animal which might supply the place of the horse, ass, or ox? That was the question. "Certainly," said Pencroft, "a beast of burden would be very useful to us until the captain has made a steam cart, or even an engine, for some day we shall have a railroad from Granite House to Port Balloon, with a branch line to Mount Franklin." One day, the 23rd of December, Neb and Top were heard shouting and barking, each apparently trying to see who could make the most noise. The settlers, who were busy at the chimneys, ran, fearing some vexatious incident. What did they see? Two fine animals of a large size that had imprudently ventured on the plateau when the bridges were open. One would have said they were horses, or at least donkeys, male and female, of a fine shape, dove-colored, the legs and tail white, striped with black on the head and neck. They advanced quietly without showing any uneasiness, and gazed at the men in whom they could not as yet recognize their future masters. "These are onagers," cried Herbert, "animals something between the zebra and the quagga." "Why not donkeys?" asked Neb. "Because they have not long ears, and their shape is more graceful." "Donkeys or horses," interrupted Pencroft. "They are moving powers, as the captain would say, and as such must be captured." The sailor, without frightening the animals, crept through the grass to the bridge over Creek Glycerine, lowered it, and the onagers were prisoners. Now, should they seize them with violence and master them by force? No. It was decided that for a few days they should be allowed to roam freely about the plateau, where there was an abundance of grass, and the engineer immediately began to prepare a stable near the poultry yard, in which the onagers might find food, with a good litter and shelter during the night. This done, the movements of the two magnificent creatures were left entirely free, and the settlers avoided even approaching them so as to terrify them. Several times, however, the onagers appeared to wish to leave the plateau, too confined for animals accustomed to the plains and forests. They were then seen following the water barrier, which everywhere presented itself before them, uttering short neighs. Then galloping through the grass and becoming calmer, they would remain entire hours gazing at the woods, from which they were cut off forever. In the meantime, harness of vegetable fiber had been manufactured, and some days after the capture of the onagers, not only the cart was ready, but a straight road, or rather a cutting, had been made through the forests of the far west, from the angle of the Mercy to Port Balloon. The cart might then be driven there, and towards the end of December they tried the onagers for the first time. Pencroft had already coaxed the animals to come and eat out of his hand, and they allowed him to approach without making any difficulty. But once harnessed, they reared and could with difficulty be held in. However, it was not long before they submitted to this new service, for the onager, being less refractory than the zebra, is frequently put in harness in the mountainous regions of southern Africa, and it has even been acclimatized in Europe, under zones of a relative coolness. On this day all the colony except Pencroft, who walked at the animals' heads, mounted the cart and set out on the road to Port Balloon. Of course, they were jolted over the somewhat rough road, but the vehicle arrived without any accident, and was soon loaded with the case and rigging of the balloon. At 8 o'clock that evening, the cart, after passing over the Mercy Bridge, descended the left bank of the river and stopped on the beach. The onagers, being unharnessed, were thence led to their stable, and Pencroft, before going to sleep, gave vent to his feelings in a deep sigh of satisfaction that awoke all the echoes of Granite House. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. The first week of January was devoted to the manufacture of the linen garments required by the colony. The needles found in the box were used by sturdy, if not delicate, fingers, and we may be sure that what was sewn firmly. There was no lack of thread, thanks to Cyrus Harding's ideas of re-employing that which had been already used in the covering of the balloon. This, with admirable patience, was all unpicked by Gideon Spilett and Herbert, for Pencroft had been obliged to give this work up, as it irritated him beyond measure. But he had no equal in the sewing part of the business. Indeed, everybody knows that sailors have a remarkable aptitude for tailoring. The cloth of which the balloon case was made was then cleaned by means of soda and potash, obtained by the incineration of plants, in such a way that the cotton, having gotten rid of the varnish, resumed its natural softness and elasticity. Then, exposed to the action of the atmosphere, it soon became perfectly white. Some dozen shirts and sock, the latter not knitted of course, but made of cotton, were thus manufactured. What a comfort it was to the settlers to clothe themselves again in clean linen, which was doubtless rather rough, but they were not troubled about that, and then to go to sleep between sheets, which made the couches at Granite House into quite comfortable beds. It was about this time also that they made boots of seal leather, which were greatly needed to replace the shoes and boots brought from America. We may be sure that these new shoes were large enough and never pinched the feet of the wearers. With the beginning of the year 1866, the heat was very great, but the hunting in the forest did not stand still. Agoutis, peccaries, capybaras, kangaroos, game of all sorts actually swarmed there, and Spilett and Herbert were too good marksmen ever to throw away their shot uselessly. Cyrus Harding still recommended them to husband the ammunition, and he took measures to replace the powder and shot which had been found in the box, and which he wished to reserve for the future. How did he know where chance might one day cast his companions and himself in the event of their leaving their domain? They should, then, prepare for the unknown future by husbanding their ammunition, and by substituting for it some easily renewable substance. To replace lead, of which Harding had found no traces in the island, he employed granulated iron, which was easy to manufacture. These bullets, not having the weight of leaden bullets, were made larger, and each charge contained less, but the skill of the sportsman made up this deficiency. As to powder, Cyrus Harding would have been able to make that also, for he had at his disposal saltpeter, sulfur, and coal. But this preparation requires extreme care, and without special tools it is difficult to produce it of a good quality. Harding preferred therefore to manufacture pyroxyle, that is to say, gun cotton, a substance in which cotton is not indispensable, as the elementary tissue of vegetables may be used, and this is found in an almost pure state, not only in cotton, but in the textile fiber of hemp and flax, in paper, the pith of the elder, etc. Now, the elder abounded in the island towards the mouth of Red Creek, and the colonists had already made coffee of the berries of these shrubs, which belonged to the family of Caprilifoliaceae. The only thing to be collected, therefore, was elder pith, for as to the other substance necessary for the manufacture of pyroxyle, it was only fuming azotic acid. Now Harding, having sulfuric acid at his disposal, had already been easily able to procure azotic acid by attacking the saltpeter with which nature supplied him. He accordingly resolved to manufacture and employ pyroxyle, although it has some inconveniences, that is to say, a great inequality of effect and excessive inflammability, since it takes fire at 170 degrees instead of 240, and lastly, an instantaneous deflagration which might damage the firearms. On the other hand, the advantages of pyroxyle consist in this, that it is not injured by damp, that it does not make the gun barrels dirty, and that its force is 4 times that of ordinary powder. To make pyroxyle, the cotton must be immersed in the fuming azotic acid for a quarter of an hour, then washed in cold water and dried. Nothing could be more simple. Cyrus Harding had only at his disposal the ordinary azotic acid, and not the fuming or monohydrate azotic acid, that is to say, acid which emits white vapors when it comes in contact with damp air, but by substituting for the latter ordinary azotic acid mixed in the proportion of from 3 to 5 volumes of concentrated sulfuric acid, the engineer obtained the same result. The sportsmen of the island therefore soon had a perfectly prepared substance which, employed discreetly, produced admirable results. About this time, the settlers cleared 3 acres of the plateau, and the rest was preserved in a wild state for the benefit of the onagers. Several excursions were made into the Yakima wood and the forests of the far west, and they brought back from thence a large collection of wild vegetables, spinach, cress, radishes, and turnips, which careful culture would soon improve, and which would temper the regimen on which the settlers had till then subsisted. Supplies of wood and coal were also carted. Each excursion was at the same time a means of improving the roads, which gradually became smoother under the wheels of the cart. The rabbit warren still continued to supply the larder of Granite House. As fortunately it was situated on the other side of Creek Glycerin, its inhabitants could not reach the plateau nor ravage the newly made plantation. The oyster bed among the rocks was frequently renewed and furnished excellent mollusks. Besides that, the fishing, either in the lake or the Mersey, was very profitable, for Pencroft had made some lines armed with iron hooks, with which they frequently caught fine trout, and a species of fish whose silvery sides were speckled with yellow, and which were also extremely savory. Master Neb, who was skilled in the culinary art, knew how to vary agreeably the bill of fare. Bread alone was wanting at the table of the settlers, and has been said they felt this privation greatly. The settlers hunted too the turtles which frequented the shores of Cape Mandible. At this place the beach was covered with little mounds, concealing perfectly spherical turtles' eggs, with white hard shells, the albumen of which does not coagulate as that of birds' eggs. They were hatched by the sun, and their number was naturally considerable, as each turtle can lay annually 250. "A regular egg field," observed Gideon Spilett, "and we have nothing to do but to pick them up." But not being contented with simply the produce, they made chase after the producers, the result of which was that they were able to bring back to Granite House a dozen of these chelonians, which were really valuable from an alimentary point of view. The turtle soup, flavored with aromatic herbs, often gained well-merited praises for its preparer, Neb. We must mention here another fortunate circumstance by which new stores for the winter were laid in. Shoals of salmon entered the Mersey, and ascended the country for several miles. It was the time at which the females, going to find suitable places in which to spawn, precede the males and make a great noise with the fresh water. 1,000 of these fish, which measured about 2.5 feet in length, came up the river, and a large quantity were retained by fixing dams across the stream. More than 100 were thus taken, which were salted and stored for the time when winter, freezing up the streams, would render fishing impracticable. By this time the intelligent Jupe was raised to the duty of valet. He had been dressed in a jacket, white linen breeches, and an apron, the pockets of which were his delight. The clever orang had been marvelously trained by Neb, and anyone would have said that the Negro and the ape understood each other when they talked together. Jupe had besides a real affection for Neb, and Neb returned it. When his services were not required, either for carrying wood or for climbing to the top of some tree, Jupe passed the greatest part of his time in the kitchen, where he endeavored to imitate Neb in all that he saw him do. The black showed the greatest patience and even extreme zeal in instructing his pupil, and the pupil exhibited remarkable intelligence in profiting by the lessons he received from his master. Judge then of the pleasure Master Jupe gave to the inhabitants of Granite House when, without their having had any idea of it, he appeared one day, napkin on his arm, ready to wait at table. Quick, attentive, he acquitted himself perfectly, changing the plates, bringing dishes, pouring out water, all with a gravity which gave intense amusement to the settlers, and which enraptured Pencroft. "Jupe, some soup." "Jupe, a little goody." "Jupe, a plate." "Jupe, good Jupe, honest Jupe." Nothing was heard but that, and Jupe, without ever being disconcerted, replied to every one, watched for everything, and he shook his head in a knowing way when Pencroft, referring to his joke of the first day, said to him, "Decidedly, Jupe, your wages must be doubled." It is useless to say that the orang was now thoroughly domesticated at Granite House, and that he often accompanied his masters to the forest without showing any wish to leave them. It was most amusing to see him walking with a stick which Pencroft had given him, and which he carried on his shoulder like a gun. If they wished to gather some fruit from the summit of a tree, how quickly he climbed for it! If the wheel of the cart stuck in the mud, with what energy did Jup, with a single heave of his shoulder, put it right again. "What a jolly fellow he is!" cried Pencroft often. "If he was as mischievous as he is good, there would be no doing anything with him." It was towards the end of January the colonists began their labors in the center of the island. It had been decided that a corral should be established near the sources of the Red Creek, at the foot of Mount Franklin, destined to contain the ruminants whose presence would have been troublesome at Granite House, and especially for the husbands who were to supply the wool for the settlers' winter garments. Each morning the colony, sometimes entire, but more often represented only by Harding, Herbert, and Pencroft, proceeded to the sources of the creek, a distance of not more than 5 miles, by the newly beaten road to which the name of Corral Road had been given. There a site was chosen, at the back of the southern ridge of the mountain. It was a meadowland, dotted here and there with clumps of trees, and watered by a little stream which sprung from the slopes which closed in it on one side. The grass was fresh, and it was not too much shaded by the trees which grew about it. This meadow was to be surrounded by a palisade, high enough to prevent even the most agile animals from leaping over. This enclosure would be large enough to contain 100 musmons and wild goats, with all the young ones they might produce. The perimeter of the corral was then traced by the engineer, and they would then have proceeded to fell the trees necessary for the construction of the palisade, but as the opening up of the road had already necessitated the sacrifice of a considerable number, those were brought and supplied 100 stakes, which were firmly fixed in the ground. The construction of this corral did not take less than 3 weeks, for besides the palisade, Cyrus Harding built large sheds in which the animals could take shelter. These buildings had also to be made very strong, for musmons are powerful animals, and their first fury was to be feared. The stakes, sharpened at their upper and hardened by fire, had been fixed by means of crossbars, and at regular distances props assured the solidity of the whole. The corral finished, a raid had to be made on the pastures frequented by the ruminants. This was done on the 7th of February, on a beautiful summer's day, and everyone took part in it. The onagers, already well trained, were ridden by Spilett and Herbert, and were of great use. The maneuver consisted simply in surrounding the musmons and goats, and gradually narrowing the circle around them. Cyrus Harding, Pencroft, Neb, and Jup posted themselves in different parts of the wood, while the 2 cavaliers and Top galloped in a radius of half a mile round the corral. The musmons were very numerous in this part of the island. These fine animals were as large as deer, their horns were stronger than those of the ram, and their gray-colored fleece was mixed with long hair. This hunting day was very fatiguing, such going and coming and running and riding and shouting. Of 100 musmons which had been surrounded, more than 2/3 escaped, but at last 30 of these animals and 10 wild goats were gradually driven back towards the corral, the open door of which appearing to offer a means of escape. They rushed in and were prisoners. In short, the result was satisfactory, and the settlers had no reason to complain. There was no doubt that the flock would prosper, and that at no distant time not only wool but hides would be abundant. That evening the hunters returned to Granite House quite exhausted. However, notwithstanding their fatigue, they returned the next day to visit the corral. The prisoners had been trying to overthrow the palisade, but of course had not succeeded, and were not long in becoming more tranquil. During the month of February, no event of any importance occurred. The daily labors were pursued methodically, and as well as improving the roads to the corral and to Port Balloon, a third was commenced, which, starting from the enclosure, proceeded towards the western coast. The yet unknown portion of Lincoln Island was that of the wood-covered Serpentine Peninsula, which sheltered the wild beasts from which Gideon Spilett was so anxious to clear the domain. Before the cold season should appear, the most assiduous care was given to the cultivation of the wild plants which had been transplanted from the forest to Prospect Heights. Herbert never returned from an excursion without bringing home some useful vegetable. One day it was some specimens of the chicory tribe, the seeds of which by pressure yielded excellent oil. Another it was some common sorrel, whose anti-scorbutic qualities were not to be despised. Then some of those precious tubers which have at all times been cultivated in South America, potatoes, of which more than 200 species are now known. The kitchen garden, now well stocked and carefully defended from the birds, was divided into small beds where grew lettuces, kidney potatoes, sorrel, turnips, radishes, and other coniferae. The soil on the plateau was particularly fertile, and it was hoped that the harvest would be abundant. They had also a variety of different beverages, and so long as they did not demand wine, the most hard to please would have had no reason to complain. To the Oswego tea and the fermented liquor extracted from the roots of the Driganier, Harding had added a regular beer made from the young shoots of the spruce fir, which, after having been boiled and fermented, made that agreeable drink called by the Anglo-Americans spring beer. Towards the end of the summer, the poultry yard was possessed of a couple of fine bustards, which belonged to the hubara species, characterized by a sort of feathery mantle, a dozen shovelers whose upper mandible was prolonged on each side by a membranous appendage, and also some magnificent cocks, similar to the Mozambique cocks, the comb, caruncle, and epidermis being black. So far everything had succeeded, thanks to the activity of these courageous and intelligent men. Nature did much for them, doubtless, but faithful to the great precept, they made a right use of what a bountiful providence gave them. After the heat of these warm summer days, in the evening when their work was finished and the sea breeze began to blow, they liked to sit on the edge of Prospect Heights, in a sort of veranda, covered with creepers, which Neb had made with his own hands. There they talked, they instructed each other, they made plans, and the rough good humor of the sailors always amused this little world, in which the most perfect harmony had never ceased to reign. They often spoke of their country, of their dear and great America. What was the result of the War of Secession? It could not have been greatly prolonged. Richmond had doubtless soon fallen into the hands of General Grant. The taking of the capital of the Confederates must have been the last action of this terrible struggle. Now the North had triumphed in the good cause. How welcome would have been a newspaper to the exiles in Lincoln Island. For 11 months all communication between them and the rest of their fellow creatures had been interrupted, and in a short time the 24th of March would arrive, the anniversary of the day on which the balloon had thrown them on this unknown coast. They were then mere castaways, not even knowing how they should preserve their miserable lives from the fury of the elements. And now, thanks to the knowledge of their captain and their own intelligence, they were regular colonists, furnished with arms, tools, and instruments. They had been able to turn to their profit the animals, plants, and minerals of the island, that is to say, the 3 kingdoms of nature. Yes, they often talked of all these things and formed still more plans. As to Cyrus Harding, he was for the most part silent, and listened to his companions more often than he spoke to them. Sometimes he smiled at Herbert's ideas or Pencroft's nonsense, but always and everywhere he pondered over those inexplicable facts, that strange enigma of which the secret still escaped him. End of chapter 8. Well, they're still alive. Let's see what happens next, shall we? If you've enjoyed this sort of content, I hope you'll remember to hit the like and subscribe, smash that bell icon, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. Good night now.